Well, Michelle, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the You're Not Alone podcast with me today. I'm very grateful to have you on. Obviously, had a chance to read through your bio and learn more about you, and had a chance to quickly connect before we hit record. And I feel like you're one of those clinicians that has their heart in the right place, and you really want to help people on their path, which means a lot to me as somebody with a lived experience that was in that dark place once upon a time, and genuinely felt like there was no way out. And so to hear that you understand that and know some of the suffering that this community can go through, I really appreciate. And I really want to go back to 2006 when I was doing research on you. It sounds like that was when you were introduced to the OCD community because of a family member who was struggling. So I'm really curious, what did you learn during that time? What was your experience like being introduced into the OCD community?
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today talking with you as well. Yeah. So back in 2006, I was already a psychologist at that point, and I was kind of a fairly new mom at that point.
Mm,
I was sort of a generalist, and I worked with children and families in a nonprofit clinic.
mm,
And I had taken a little bit of time off to kind of tend to family matters. And it became really obvious that one of my kids had OCD.
mm,
Um, and only the thing is that I didn't actually recognize that he had obsessive compulsive disorder until it was really stereotypical stuff, the
mm.
washing kind of thing. So
Yep.
even as a psychologist, I missed the signs,
Yeah.
right? So
Which is
I'd never
common,
had a
by
plan.
the way.
Pardon?
That's very common.
Yeah,
It's very
yeah.
common
It
to miss the signs because of the information that is available publicly. And I've had a lot of psychologists on that talk about, like, if it's not what you specialize in school, you touch on it in school, but you don't go in depth. And I feel like that's maybe where some gaps can be missed.
No, they definitely don't teach us. When I went to school and when some of my colleagues who've gone more recently went, they don't really go in depth about understanding OCD. And sometimes I look at the textbooks that I have that talk about it and what it is, and it's actually awful when you look at it. So it's embarrassing. So at any rate, luckily I did recognize what was going on and was introduced into the community. Luckily, went to a specialist,
Mm,
and like right out of the gate, we were able to be introduced to someone who was a specialist. And I realized
mm,
that that's unusual because I've met so many people who had a journey where went to people who said they treated OCD but didn't treat OCD. We actually went to someone who treated OCD, got exposure and response prevention, but I learned it as mom in the room. So everything about being a psychologist went out the door, except I was fascinated with what was going on.
yeah.
And I remember seeing this process that changed my son's life. It changed our family's life. And so after that, I just really wanted to advocate because I figured if, as a psychologist, I didn't understand OCD and the appropriate treatment for it and what it was. I didn't want other parents and families to go through a period of not knowing how to get treatment, or what
Mm,
OCD was. So additionally, my plan was just to do advocacy, and I went to an OCD Foundation conference and like fell in love
mm.
with the community, fell in love with the treatment, and so I started dipping my toe into the water and haven't looked back since.
It's a beautiful community, isn't it? It's I feel like it's such a good group of people, both clinicians and the people that have lived experience.
It really is. I mean, I've never met anything else like this before. People are just, they want to help, they're supportive, they're fun.
They
You
are.
have to be able to laugh, right? When you're dealing with OCD, you have to be able to laugh. So there's a lot of laughing that goes on.
There is. Humor's been a big part of my recovery journey, and it's
Yeah.
been super helpful. I'm curious, what was it like being a mother in the room, watching your son struggle with OCD?
Um, it was hard. It was. I mean, first seeing him struggle at home was really hard, but then seeing his first exposures and seeing how hard he was working. I mean, I was both inspired by him because of how brave he was. He was really young at the time. He
Mm,
was like 7 years old.
yeah.
Um, so I was inspired by his bravery. And I also just, as a mom, when you see your child suffering and struggling, what do? You want to jump in, you want to help, you want to make it better. You don't want them to suffer.
Yeah.
And that was really hard, not stepping in and going, okay, we're done. We're not going to do this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Holding myself back. And then I was taught to be the person who would go home and have him do his exposures with him.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that was tough work. I mean, it's not easy work, even though there was, he saw so much improvement from it.
As a mother, how do you get a 7-year-old to understand what they have, which is OCD, and then how do you get them to face those fears when facing our fears is something that is so against our human nature? I mean, we feel fear as an emotion to get our attention, to get us to take an action to keep us safe. So, I mean, what did you have to do to kind of work him into that process?
Right, right. So you also mentioned, there being other themes. There were many other themes, and there have been over time. Um,
Okay.
but I think with kids, obviously we talk to them just a little bit different. We talk in language that kids understand. So although I do this with adults too, you might talk about an OCD monster with kids,
Yeah.
but I have adults who call their OCD a monster too that I work with.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but how do we decide as adults that we wanna get past something? He knew that he couldn't do the things he wanted to do, and his therapist was able to explain to him in his language, in ways that he could understand, that nothing had to hold him back, and that, he could be brave and he could be able to
Mm,
do the things that he wanted to do, and he was, like,
mm,
all on board with that, like, yeah, I wanna be able to play with my games again. Yeah, I don't wanna have to keep running out of the classroom or this or that. And so it was
yeah.
like, "Oh, all right, it's gonna be, kinda tough." But of course, as one of my mentors, said when she was teaching me, um, we are not above bribing kids either when we need to do this work. So he was really into earning like Pokemon cards at the time. And so whenever he
Nice.
would do one of his exposures in between session, he would get one of those Pokemon cards. So, it was
My
like
mom
he
did
could
something
see
similar
job
for
well
me.
done.
Yeah, I my mom literally used Pokemon cards as bribing for me too when I was younger. It wasn't for exposures, it was to do chores, but it worked nonetheless. So I think that that's
Yeah.
definitely that's funny,
Yes.
number 1, and number 2, it's effective. It's an effective tool. So
Yeah.
he dove
Yeah. I
right
mean,
into it?
Yes, yeah, he definitely did. I mean, there was a lot of teaching and explaining to him at first, just like I do with my child clients now. A lot of explaining in ways they can understand. And so by the time that it's time to do exposures, if you've got a child who's really interested, and he was like, "Okay, I'm ready. Let's get started." So, yeah. So he was definitely on board with it after he'd gotten that explanation. Plus, he got those little rewards each time.
Yeah. Now, how old is your son now?
He's a young adult now. He's 23.
Young adult. And how is he doing with his OCD now? I'm curious.
It's one of those things where it's a lifelong thing, right?
Yep.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
so I think he faces it as much as anybody does, and
Okay.
the difference now is that as mom, I have to step out more, right? Where I was
Okay.
more of the coach, then it's like, this is his life now. He gets to make his decisions. And my job is to love him and support him. And if he wants my help, I'm there. But yeah, it's much more on him now.
Yeah, which makes total sense to me. And it is a lifelong journey for sure. Something that every single day you have to show up and do the work. And I think for family members and friends, it can be kind of hard to understand that. What do you wish you would have known at the start of his OCD journey? What is like one of the first things that you tell a mom or a dad when they find out that their child or their young adult has OCD?
Hmm. You know, I think the first thing I do is try to offer a message of hope that there's help for this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that your child, your loved one doesn't have to suffer, and neither do you,
Mm.
right? But there's something else, and we talk about this all the time. I mentioned to you earlier that I volunteer my time and lead a support group for parents of kids with OCD, and we constantly are touching on the that this is your child's OCD. This is their journey. It's not yours. And you
Mm.
can't tell them how they have to approach this or that they even have to do the treatment, right?
Mm.
Because so many times I see parents agonizing over watching their kids suffer, and maybe their child is not wanting to do their treatment. They're not wanting to do exposures, and or they're jumping in when they're seeing their child facing a challenge and they're trying to get them to do the work, right? Because it's like they have
Mm.
almost a no OCD zone going on. And
Yeah.
all the time, it's like, no, you have to step back. You have to let them want this. You have to let them own it. Just like anything else in life that they're going to do, we can't do it for them and we can't make them want it. And so that's a
Mm.
really big message that I communicate. Probably because I struggled with it so much myself,
Mm. Yeah.
right?
W-
Watching my son suffer and struggle, I cannot tell you how much I wanted to fix it to make it better, and I still want to, you know? Both my kids are young adults now, and I want to fix it, I wanna make it better for them, and I can't, and I have to remember to step back.
I, as you're talking about that, I'm picturing being a parent, seeing somebody struggle, and I empathize with you and parents because it's you can from the outside looking in, I can only imagine that there's almost just this feeling of like, just do this thing, and like, if you just do these exposures, you can be a lot better, and if you do XYZ, like, you can improve your life so much more, and it's kind of like you can see it from the outside. And having been that person that was tangled in that web of just,
Mm,
I did not know what was up and what was down. Like, the classic stuff. Is this the stuff that people get caught up in all the time? Is this an OCD thought or is this a me thought?
mhm,
And it's like, okay, well, I'll tell you first off, if there's one thing I've learned over the years in my recovery is, like, if you have to ask, more than likely you have your answer. But the actual answer is, don't even ask. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Like, I don't know
mhm,
for sure. Um, but it must just be so challenging to watch somebody struggle with something that, you know, we can't physically see it. It's going on in the brain, and you kind of see the steps that people could take to reclaim their lives. How do you recommend somebody support a loved one who's struggling with OCD? If they can't make them do something and they can't force them to do anything, how do they walk alongside them in that journey? I guess, what do they do? I don't even really know how to ask it, other than I'm just curious what your perspective is on how somebody can support someone with OCD.
yeah. So, I think, I hear from the people in the support group that I run, right? And
Mhm.
so I also run a support group for, um, adults who have OCD, and what I hear from them over and over that they really want from the people who support and love them is, number 1, for them to learn about OCD. So I would
Mm.
say the first thing is learn about it. Understand it. Don't assume that you know about it. Get informed. That's one of the best things that you can do. So listening to podcasts like this one, or YouTube channels where they cover this, or going to the International OCD Foundation website and learning there. There's just so many wonderful resources out there. Um, But besides that, I would also say ask the person that you
Mm,
care for what they would like from you. I mean, I mean, think about how good it feels to be asked, how can I support you? What would you like from me? And a lot of times people forget that, to ask. They assume that they know what to do and what's best. And so whether you're a parent of somebody or a partner of somebody or a sibling or, however you might be related to somebody, um, it asking them, What can I do? How would you like me to support?" Or if you don't know what you'd like right now, please know I'm open at any point in time,
mm,
right? And being careful not to jump in and assume that everything that you see is OCD. You
mm,
know, the kids that I work with, the adults I work with, the my own son, like, they don't want you to assume that everything that's going on is all about OCD,
mm.
right? So maybe gently asking, "Hey, could that be?" But then your loved one may not even want you to do that, right?
Yeah.
So, the other thing I was gonna say too, so part of it is supporting the person with OCD, right? Learning and asking how to help. The other part is taking care of yourself. If
Mm,
you love somebody, you're in a relationship with someone that has OCD, I think the biggest thing that we forget is to take care of ourselves, right? Because I know
uh,
as mom, right, I was always thinking about how can I support my my child, right? And I
right.
hear that from other parents, and I see that from, partners. So, stepping back, if you're not taking care of you, then there's no way that you can be a good support to the person that you love who has OCD.
Mm. How do you create those boundaries?
You mean between taking care of yourself and yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good question. How do you create those
Yeah.
boundaries?
Well, because I'll be
I
honest
mean
with you. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
oh, please cut me off. Go ahead.
Well, it was just like the reason why I ask is now you've got me thinking on my end, and it's like I think a lot about my wife and how I mean, uh, it also could be that I have this podcast and I travel the country speaking to college students about mental health generally speaking, and then I advocate for OCD. So this has OCD is a part of who I am. It's not all of who I am, and then it is how I make a living and supporting this community and traveling the country. So I guess it's in that sense, it's a part of my life. But my wife and I talk about my OCD every single day, and
Mhm,
it does make me think about. And I've thought about this before, but it's just you're bringing it back up. Like that's a lot. She's gotten her reps in. She's earned her stripes. She's talked about this. She could tell you everything about OCD. I feel like she's so educated on the topic, and it, I just have to imagine that for her, I'm sure that there are days where it's like she just doesn't want to have those conversations. And we're not always talking about my OCD in the capacity of like I'm struggling, I need your help. Sometimes it's talking about, oh, I just interviewed this great guest and this is what we talked about and it was really cool. But that's why I ask about the boundaries because I could just imagine, a lifetime of living with somebody who has OCD, how that could, if you don't have the right boundaries put in place. I don't know. Like, I think it could at times maybe be a little exhausting and maybe there could be some burnout there. And I'm cautious with my words because I don't want anybody with OCD to not, it's like the classic, I don't want to be a burden to others. So
mhm.
I'm not saying hold in what you struggle with, guys, just so you know, like that's not the messaging I'm saying, but I am curious, yeah, just what your thoughts are on how you create those boundaries. Cause especially for me, I think about it even for my wife and wanting to respect her energy as well.
Yeah. So one of the first things I think we have to do is respect people to set their own boundaries, right? So
Mm,
just like you were saying you're being careful because you don't want someone with OCD to feel like they're a burden, right? And I hear that all the time, right? I don't want
yep.
to burden people. I am a burden. Share. If you're the person with OCD, share what you're going through, reach out for support, and trust that the people that you love are going to let you know if they need to have a break or not right now or set up a time with you, right? Like, I think when we assume that we're burdening other people, right, then we may not do the sharing that we need to do. So it's like we have to
Yeah.
put trust in other people to set their boundaries. But I think, man, it's a tightrope, Zach, right? Setting those boundaries, right?
Yeah.
First, like I think about parents. Okay, so parents, they moms especially. Okay, just stereotypically from what I see, the moms do this,
Mm-hmm.
but I've seen dads do it too. Everything is for their kids, and they
Mm.
forget about having a life themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about kind of I don't know. I've had to do this where I've had to step back and go, wait, what are the things I want for myself in life?
Mm.
Right? As somebody who loves, and it's just so you know, it's not just my son. There are multiple people in my very close sphere who have OCD. Okay.
Right.
And I didn't even find out about it until later on, until after I found out about my son.
Mm.
But so I have to really step back and ask myself, like, what are the things that I want for me? And am I taking care of those things? And if I'm not asking those questions of myself about what I want, what I will find out is I start to feel burnt out,
Mm.
meaning like I'm too tired to do the things that I want to do, or the things that I want to do aren't giving me any pleasure anymore, or I don't feel passionate about them anymore. And so then it's like, okay, I have to take stock of what is it that I'm doing that's causing me to feel this way right now. So I would
Mm.
just say it's always stepping back and taking stock and noticing if you start to feel like burnt out or that you don't have the energy. Um, and I man, I lost my train of thought, um, but also I think it's this, like I was talking about the stepping back and, trusting others too. Like, you have to have other things in your life besides taking care of another person when they're struggling,
Mm.
right?
I
And
I have a question.
like I'm really struggling with this particular thing. Like, how do you really set the boundary?
Well, I no, I think actually what you provided was really helpful. The word that comes to mind for me is fear. If I'm a mother, if I'm a father, if I'm a loved one, and I know that the person that I care about has OCD and that they struggle with intrusive thoughts, they have anxiety, they might struggle with anxiety, depression, suicidal ideations. There might be this feeling of like, I have to white knuckle my loved one's recovery. Like, I have to be there on the wheel with them, controlling the situation. And what you said about taking a step back and taking stock and being a whole person outside of your loved one, I'll say loved one, that's, son, daughter, fiance, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife,
Mhm.
whatever it might be. Um, being something more than just the person that is now your whole purpose and meaning has become helping them with recovering and reclaiming their life. And fear
Right.
is the word that comes to mind. How, like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's actually, thank you so much for saying that, because it's really, really a big deal. I've seen adults come in, and these are, partners of people with OCD, where they are terrified. They're terrified that if they don't help stay on top of what's going on with their loved one, that their loved one is just like not going to make it. They're going to fall apart.
Mm,
Maybe they'll lose their life. Right. And what
right.
happens is they will sacrifice themselves in that, where
Yeah.
they really have no life. I've met people who they won't even leave the house because they're afraid that
Wow.
their loved one with OCD isn't going to be able to make it if they're not in the home, right? So yeah,
Does
the if fear is guiding you, then that's a good sign that you've got to kind of step back a little bit and develop more of your own life. And sometimes that means getting involved in your own treatment.
mm, yeah, and the word that comes to mind for me there is acceptance, right? Like accepting that you you have to have your life too, that you can't white knuckle somebody's recovery. They have to want it themselves. Because then the other word that comes to mind is enablement. And I feel like I've read a decent amount about enablement in OCD recovery, in loved ones, participating in compulsions and things knowingly and unknowingly to keep the loved one safe and comfortable. But that's almost to the detriment of the individual. And also, I think there's something to be said because there was so little understanding about OCD when for like in my social circle when I was going through it. I think my wife was
Mhm.
educating herself and learning, and I think my parents have done a little bit of educating, but like outside of that, I don't really think that people were jumping on IOCDF's website and getting the lowdown on what I was struggling with. I definitely had a close friend or two that knew what was going on as well. So it's hard to understand what the individual is going through. But I say that all to say, at a certain point in my recovery, I remember I was sitting in my car outside of work, and I had already been diagnosed with OCD. I was just as anxious and depressed as I was before I walked into the psychologist's office and got that diagnosis. And I remembered sitting there and being like, this whole kind of victimhood mentality that I've got going right now, where I feel bad for myself that I have OCD, where I'm frustrated and pissed off that this has to be my brain, that I have to have this for the rest of my life, that it's BS. I'll give the G-rated version of what I was saying in the car, that this is BS, that this is unfair, this should have never happened to me. I just wish that I would have had like a brain transplant. I remember that was like something running in my head.
Mhm.
I was like, none of this is working. I just keep getting worse, and I can sit here and deny what I'm going through, but until I take ownership over this recovery journey, I'm going to stay stuck. I'm never going to get any better. And I think a big part of why I've recovered to the place that I've recovered to is I had a lot of support and help along the way, but nobody was doing it for me.
Yeah.
It's like I
Yeah.
had some friends growing up where their mom would put toothpaste on their toothbrush all the way through high school. And they've now kind of had some issues in the real world. And it's because there was some enablement there. And I just think that, like you said, it's a fine line that you walk. But I'm always empathetic to people with OCD. But at the end of the day, it's on us. If you have OCD, you have to do, like, if you want to reclaim your life, you have to do the work. You can have people help you and support you, but you have to do the work. And that's not to be preachy or anything. It took a turning point for me. I mean, it just was basically me realizing my life is no better than what it was 4 months ago when I received this diagnosis, and I've got a choice
Mhm.
to make. And
Yeah.
and my recovery wasn't linear either. So I think that that's also something interesting to bring up when you talk about taking that step back and not
Yeah.
being led by fear.
Yeah. Rick, first of all, you are not the only person with OCD who wish they could have a brain transplant.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I hear that
Yep.
one.
Do
But when
you?
you're talking about, oh yeah, oh yeah, why do I have to have this brain? I hear that a lot. And I just say, no, you've got a beautiful brain. There's so
Yes.
many things that it can do. But when you talk about, you were calling it enablement, right? And in the OCD world, we call it accommodation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what is accommodation? It's basically when the people around the person with OCD do things to try to help ease their discomfort.
Mm.
Like, hey, I'm not sure that I locked the car door. Can you double check and make sure that I locked it? Right.
Yep.
Or um, eh, I just had this thought that I have feelings for someone else. I just need you to know that. That's okay, right? And then they're looking for reassurance, and the person that they're sharing this with starts reassuring them, or, you know, just any number of ways that we try to ease the distress of someone who's struggling with OCD, right? And we know that what happens is the more that you accommodate and try to ease the distress of the person that you love with OCD, that OCD grows and it thrives from that,
Mm. Mm.
right? And it's almost like there's this dual thing that has to go on in recovery from OCD, right? First, the person with OCD has to own it and do the work like you were talking about doing.
Mm,
And then the people that love them have to love them enough to step back and stop easing the distress,
mm,
right? We have to believe that they can handle it. So you were asking me, like, when I was with my son and I saw him struggling through exposures, like, I had to believe, and I still have to believe, that he can handle discomfort, right? Because what am I saying if I keep coming in and rescuing you?
mm,
I'm saying, like, I'm communicating that I don't believe that you can handle it.
mm,
And that is not that is not what you need communicated to you if you're struggling with OCD. You
right.
need to hear the people around you saying, "I believe that you can handle this feeling, whatever it is that you're going through, and that you can get through it, right? And that you're not fragile."
Mm,
And the thing that I tell people when they're watching someone that they love, whether it's their child or an adult partner or their parent or friend, because I have friends who come to me, talk to me about their friend with OCD even, you know,
mhm,
um, what I will say to them is, you know, when you're asking your loved one to do these exposures, to do this hard work, and then you're struggling to not accommodate, to not step in and do this stuff that's supporting the OCD and not the sufferer. I want you to
yeah.
realize that like how hard it is for you to pull back and not do these things. You're getting a taste of how hard it is for them to do the work that you're asking them to do.
Mm,
Right?
that is very powerful and a great point. And I've never heard that said before.
Yeah, I see it a
It's a great
lot with
example.
parents. Like they will be on their kids about, you're going to do this exposure work, you're going to do it, but then they can't step back themselves and not accommodate. Like, you're getting a taste of how hard it is for your kid.
So that brings up an interesting question then. Accommodation versus accountability. How do you toe the line?
Accommodation versus accountability. Tell me more what you mean.
Well, if I'm a parent and I've been told by a therapist, for example, hey, your son or daughter has homework. If they do this homework in between sessions, they'll more than likely recover at a faster pace. And by the way, my definition, we should probably level set on recovery definition. And this is also for people listening. I want to be very clear and careful for people. When I say recover, if I say that I've recovered, which I think that I'm in recovery, but I do think that I have reclaimed a large portion of my life, and that is my definition. I don't define recovery as if I never have an intrusive thought ever again, then I've recovered. I think that that's a big trap that I see a lot of people in the OCD community. They can fall into that trap where it's like, I will be
Mhm.
happy when insert never have an intrusive thought again, never feel anxious again, never feel uncomfortable emotion. So my definition of recovery is I'm living a values based life based on the things that are important to me. And that OCD takes up a really small portion of my overall life in terms of, I guess, the negative side, because I'm a podcast. I talk about OCD on my podcast. I write about it. I do things. So it takes up my life in that sense, but that's based on my values. So that's my definition of recovery. And I guess what I mean is like, as a parent, if I know, or if as a loved one, I know, okay, if so and so does their exposures and does the homework in between, I know that they can reclaim their life faster. I want to hold them accountable. So Tuesday night rolls around and it's like, hey, you said at 6 p.m. you were going to sit down for half an hour and do your exposures. It's nearly 7 o'clock. Like, have you done them yet? That to me is the definition of accountability versus actually accommodating them, which is like, oh, you don't want any knives in the kitchen, like we can hide those for you. My point is, how do you
Mhm.
hold somebody accountable while also not doing the exposures for them, because then I feel like as a that almost feels like accommodating in its own sense as well. Like, I'm going to do these exposures with you, which I know that, again, that can be encouraged and that can be accomplished, but how do you make it so that it's almost what you said earlier, like where you're not rushing in and kind of displaying through your actions that that person can't, you don't believe that that person can get through it themselves. So how do
Mm-hmm.
you hold somebody accountable without accommodating or demonstrating through your actions that you don't believe that they can do it?
Okay. So first, I completely agree with your definition of recovery. We're on the same page there.
Okay.
Um, and so again, it depends on the role that you're playing in somebody's, their homework, right, and their
Mm,
recovery process, right. So if like, so I'm gonna go from the standpoint of assuming that people are in a role where they're helping to hold people accountable for doing whatever it is they're supposed to be following up on in therapy. So,
okay.
when we're dealing with little kids, younger kids, um, it's going to be like parent actually is going to be much more directive, setting up
Mm,
times for we're going to do it. We're going to do our practice now, and and it's interesting because I think for some parents, seeing their kids do the work is so hard that sometimes they won't hold their child accountable for doing it. Oh, you don't want to
mm,
do it today? Okay, we don't have to do it, right?
yeah.
And so I've seen sometimes a pattern where they're not following up, and then it's for me as therapist, it's kind of stepping back and helping see what's going on here that's getting in the way of the follow
Mm,
through. But at the same time, when I've seen parents ask their kids to follow through on their homework, and the kid starts to argue and they're refusing, and I think it's one thing to put your foot down and say, no, we're going to do this and we're going to do it now. But if a child continues to say, no, I'm not doing it, there's no way, no how, I tell parents, don't continue. Don't go
yeah.
forward. Don't force that kid to do their homework,
Mm,
right? Because once you're forcing them, now it's not their own, they're not owning their own OCD anymore.
mm,
Right? If you're forcing them and arguing and it's like they're doing it kicking and screaming and not because they want to, now what's happening is you're just kind of ruining your relationship with your child, right?
mm,
So, I think holding them accountable is about we're going to do it at the set time. We're going to do it how you said. I'm going to support you in whatever way we agreed with your therapist. I'm going to coach you through your exposures. And you follow through, great. And then there's this reward that you've earned if there have been some rewards agreed upon, right? But
mhm,
in with some of the young adults and the adults that I work with, and even the older teens, they may have agreed with somebody that they want them to help support them with their exposures between session. And but I've seen it where like that person has decided that they're just not going to do it. And now it becomes an argument with them and their spouse or their partner or their whoever it is that's supporting them, right? It's endless who it could be, right? Now they're getting into an
mhm,
argument about it, right?
yeah.
So again, it's like if a person is like, no, I'm just not going to do it. Well, like, don't force them, right?
Yeah.
So you can have an agreement that, hey, we're going to follow through and I'm going to support you to do it. And that's great. You're helping to hold them accountable. Like I have a couple of clients where their spouse actually does exposures with them. Like
Mm,
really hysterical, strong, powerful, knock your socks off kinds of exposures. But it's something they've
yeah.
agreed to do together, right? But sometimes the person with OCD is just like, no, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And you have to respect their autonomy, right?
Yeah.
And their right to say no. But that doesn't mean that what you do then is you slip back into, okay, well, I'll hold the knife since you're not willing to, right?
Yeah.
If part of what they're working on is being able to hold knives again. So it's like, yes, if they're arguing with you and aren't going to do their exposures or don't want you to be a part of them, cool, step back, let them take their own, let them be autonomous and do that, but don't use that as a reason to slip back and, okay, then I'm going to do all these things that are going to grow your disorder. I'm going to check the locks for you. I'm going to,
Mm,
hide the knives for you. I'm going to do this, right? It's like now you have to let them struggle, right?
mm,
And honestly, like I'm actually thinking of a situation where a particular person was afraid to hold knives. And so their partner had a choice, like I can make their dinner for them or I can let them struggle through the process of cooking. And in this particular case, this person was like, I am not going to cook your meal for you then. You're going to have to figure it
mm.
out. Yeah.
I mean,
And that can really
yeah,
take guts to do.
it can. I always talk about stealing from your future self when you don't do your exposures. You're giving yourself temporary relief and stealing joy from your future self. So for me,
Mm-hmm.
while I do feel like that takes a lot of guts to stand in as a partner and say, hey, I mean, I've cooked my side of the meal. I've used the knife. Like, if you want this meal, you're going to have to come over here and use this knife and face this fear. I think that is important, and I'm sure that there's nuance, and a lot of people might have a different perspective, but I appreciate that example because that's a form of accountability that I kind of, though the analogy that I use with people is like, that's just like a little investment that you made into the bank that's going to pay dividends in the future by being held accountable into kind of, I don't want to use the word force, but like it was kind of like, hey, the knife is here. You need it to cook your part of the meal. It's either you're not eating tonight, or you're gonna have to face the fear and pick up the knife and make it happen tonight. And I think that a little bit of that, I received a little bit of that, like a little kick in the butt
Yeah.
uh, at points in my recovery journey. And I almost kind of look at it like almost like a personal trainer at the gym. I work out so much harder when I've got somebody telling me how many reps to do, not letting me skimp on the reps. It just, I always get a better workout in than if it's just me by myself.
Right.
And so
Right.
I think that that's a really good analogy.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a really good analogy, right? If you've got somebody who's kind of like pushing you along a little bit. At the same time, right, I want to be really mindful and say, like, if you've been accommodating, if you've been doing
Mm,
certain things to help your loved
yeah.
one avoid distress, got to be
Yep.
careful and not just pull the rug out on from under them entirely. Like when I'm talking about like just the example of okay, well, you're not going to use the knife, I'm not going to help you with the knife. That's also assuming that a person is working on that, right? Like this has
Mm,
been an agreed upon thing in their treatment, and in their recovery that, okay, I'm going to start using knives now. Okay, so my
yep.
role as your supporter, as your loved one, is going to be, I'm then not going to do it for you, right? But I've seen this happen many times where we explain to people, okay, so with your loved one with OCD, we don't want you to accommodate them. And then they go home and they remove everything they've been doing, right? So
Yes.
we've been talking about where it can be really hard not to do those things. I've seen people who are so gung ho and they really want to tackle this OCD thing, and they take full responsibility and
Yep.
they stop doing everything. It's like, no, wait, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but like, let's put the brakes on. Let's agree with your loved one what we're removing and when.
Yes.
So,
Okay. And that is a really important distinction. And it's almost like that phased approach to exposures. That's the same thing with support, where if you've gone from nothing but accommodating and now you've learned that there's another way, there's a phased approach to transitioning out of accommodating and more into accountability, and not just, like you said, pulling the rug out from underneath them. So I think that is I'm glad that you made that point. It's really important.
right. It's always best if it's a team approach where it's the person with OCD, a therapist or another neutral party and their loved one, right? You all make the decision
Yes.
together, but nobody makes that unilaterally. So,
Yes, absolutely. Um, I have a couple more questions for you. I want to be respectful of your time. What about like a parent who has, I mean, this is your situation, and I'm not looking to understand the specific dynamics between you and your son, but let's say you have an older, a son or daughter that's in their adult years. They have OCD, they've struggled on and off. Maybe there's been some struggles with career and finances and relationships and other things like that. Do you recommend, do you ever have parents come to you and ask, hey, like, you know, my son or daughter is struggling to hold down a job, their finances are a little off right now, I'm kind of subsidizing their living expenses right now. Are there boundaries that parents need to set with finances and getting involved in, a child's relationships? I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I definitely have had parents come to me, and I've had, parents of adults come and say, I want to understand this better. Or I have a I have a kid who is not wanting to get treatment and I just don't know what to do. Right. Because
Mm-hmm.
that definitely does happen where there's someone with OCD, they don't want to get treatment for it. And the parents just, they're stuck in the cycle and they don't know what to do.
Mm.
So usually what it is I'm always looking at like what's the individual situation. And by the
Okay.
way, there are growing number of support groups out there right now that are free. You
Mm.
can find them on the OCD Foundation's website, and they are for parents of adult children with OCD, because this
Mm.
is actually not as uncommon as we would think. It's fairly common,
Yeah.
and parents get wrapped up in it. So I think you have to really look at, is the adult child with OCD in treatment,
Mm.
right? If they're in treatment, then it's, how can I support you in the treatment and how can I slowly get unwound from it? And then sometimes maybe that parent or those parents can get involved in their adult child's treatment
Mm.
and learn how to slowly step back, right? Or they
Okay.
can work with somebody separately on their own, and hopefully the therapist can coordinate a little bit, right? Because sometimes, you don't want your parents in your OCD therapy, but maybe you're willing to let therapists exchange information. And then they
Right.
can decide, like, how do we slowly unwind? Like, we're giving, financial support. What are appropriate expectations for us to have of you, and how will we slowly step back from that? Okay, so
Mm.
this is something that can be done, with the supportive therapist, or having a conversation, right? Sometimes you can sit down with your adult child and say, we want to start to be stepping back, and you can have a productive conversation about how to do that, right? Agreeing on it together. But it's a different thing when you're dealing with somebody who's not in treatment,
Mm.
refusing treatment, doesn't want to change what they're doing. Um, and that's where unilaterally parents may need to make well-informed decisions about how to slowly step back. Like, what are our means? What are we capable of doing? What are we willing to do? What are we not willing to do? What things are causing our child to live comfortably with this disorder and not need to make any changes? So I think that's where being involved in a support group with other parents who have been through this, and hopefully with a professional leading it who can help to give some guidance, can be
Mm.
really useful to help you slowly step back.
You made an excellent
Yeah.
point too, because the question becomes, for somebody who's resistant to treatment, do they, is it because they're comfortable, and because they're comfortable, they don't want to get uncomfortable, and there's money coming in to sort of subsidize their living, and if there was a little bit of discomfort involved in the form of finances or mom and dad pulling back a little bit on the support, would that then be the catalyst to get them into treatment? I don't know the answer to that question. It sounds like there are experts that in these support groups that would have a much clearer idea on that. But I think that you bring up a really good point in terms of the support group, the phased approach, the differentiation between a loved one who is actively in recovery, they're doing the treatment, they want to get better, versus somebody who's kind of resisting any change. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you
And
sharing that.
and we have to know that some people, even if we start to pull back, they're not ever going to make a decision to get into treatment, right? I mean,
Mm,
it's an individual's right to decide if they will or they won't. Um, and I would say that it's layered and it's complicated in terms of
mm,
what are parents willing to do and what are they not willing to do. And I'm just going to say that every family's situation is different, and where people might pull back from overly accommodating their adult child's OCD is going to be different for every family.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's like you said, it's unique to that individual's current situation,
Yeah.
and experience. So it has to be a tailored approach. Um, Michelle, I think that this was a really, really important conversation. I know that there are a lot of parents out there supporting a loved one. And I think that one of the big things that I like that you touched on today was that there's support for the loved one, and then there's support for the person supporting a loved one. And I think too often, and that's why you have a unique approach, is we sort of forget about the person who's doing the supporting. And um, the just the emotional fatigue that could have on somebody. Again, being mindful, we're not suggesting that if you have OCD that you keep it in, that you don't open up. But it's both parties taking care of themselves through the journey of recovery that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is. It's about the person with OCD taking care of themselves and the loved ones making sure that they take care of themselves too. And it's really on each person to do that.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this as we kind of wrap up the podcast today. What advice would you give to someone who is supporting a loved one with OCD right now, um, in order for them to take care of themselves and not get burned out in that process?
Mm. Yeah, I would just say step back and take a look at what do you want for you? What's important to you? You know,
Mm,
it's cliche, we hear it all the time, but it's that old thing about, like, putting on your oxygen mask before helping someone else, you know?
yep.
Are you healthy? Are you taking care of yourself? Because first and foremost, you've gotta take care of you, because the healthier that you are, the better that you're doing emotionally, the more that you can really be a good solid support for somebody who's struggling, right?
Mm,
So that's super important. F Get information for yourself, get a support group if you need one, see a therapist for yourself if you need one, get involved with, um, communities that are out there that are talking about OCD, but make sure that you're attending to the basics of your own health and well-being.
mm.
So that's what I would say. And you are
Valuable
definitely
advice.
not alone out there. There are so many other parents or loved ones who are going through what you are, and so connect with them.
Mm. You're not alone. That's the title of my book, and that is seems to be timeless advice in terms of giving people the hope that they need too. So I agree with that, full heartedly, and I really appreciate you coming on, Michelle, and giving this perspective. I think that this is going to be a really helpful episode for a lot of people. How can people connect with you and your work?
Um, so I guess the easiest way to connect with me is through my website. It's drmichellewitkin.com, doctor spelled DR. Drmichellewitkin.com is probably the easiest way.
Okay, amazing. Well, Dr. Witkin, or Michelle, as you instructed me to say, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. You are a wealth of knowledge, a very hopeful voice in the space, and I appreciate your time. So thank you.
Thank you so much.